Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Andy Teffer. I'm co-chair of the International Committee of the Brooklyn Book Festival. And it's a great pleasure tonight to host the conversation Acts of Courage with Roxane Gay and Okey Ndibe, focusing on their early debut novels. We want to start by acknowledging the great indie presses and bookstores that put this event together. Indie presses have a unique role in the book ecosystem. They find and foster fresh talents, marginalized voices, and brilliant debuts, not to mention bringing us, whoops. Hold on. Can we get the screen smaller? Oh, I see. We'll run through this slideshow and then I'll continue. So these are the 10 bookstores that are sponsoring the event, and the books will be for sale. We'll put a link up. You can get the copy. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So the indie presses have a unique role in the book ecosystem, finding and fostering talents, marginalized voices, and brilliant debuts, not to mention bringing us fresh original voices from around the world, both contemporary authors and the classics of international literature. So thank you to Grove Atlantic Press and Soho Press for hosting tonight's event, and thank you for the work you do. Our 10 bookstore partners have been through a lot this year between closings and world-altering changes. We've missed them, and it's made clear how important they are to us all. But they're still out there finding us great books, supporting our local communities, and organizing events like this one. Let's keep them going, and let's especially support them over the holiday season. I know we could certainly use one here in Jackson Heights, Queens, where I live. So you'll see the links in the chat for the bookstores, and you can support them by purchasing the books. So now just a quick abbreviated bios for our two authors, and then we'll discuss their works more in a moment. Okey Ndibe's debut novel, Arrows of Rain, was published in 2000 and has just been reissued in a 20th anniversary edition. He's also the author of a second novel, Foreign Gods, Inc., and most recently, a memoir, Never Look an American in the Eye, a memoir of flying turtles, colonial ghosts, and the making of a Nigerian American. Roxane Gay's debut novel, An Untamed State, came out in 2014. She's also the author of two books of stories, Difficult Women and Haiti, and the nonfiction books, Bad Feminists and Hunger, among other works. Most recently, she's the editor of the selected works of Audre Lorde. So we're gonna begin with a reading, and then I'll ask questions, and then we'll open up for chat for questions from the audience. So who would like to go first? First of all, where are you both, and how are you? Welcome.
Thank you for having us. I am in New York City until the end of the month.
And okay?
You're muted. Okay.
I actually muted myself. Can you hear me?
We're getting to a rough start, but we're going to do this.
Well, yeah. I'm in West Hartford, Connecticut.
Yes,
so that's home for me.
Well, this program is organized around your two debut novels, so we're going back in time. So hope you can get your minds around an old work. Mm-hmm. But who would like to start? And do you want to set up the novels? Okay, would you?
Well, let me start.
Yeah.
So my novel is, my first novel is Arrows of Rain. It was published 20 years ago this year. And so I'm so delighted that Soho has released a 20th year anniversary edition of the novel, in which I write an essay as an introduction. Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, I haven't got my copy of the new of the edition, but I write an essay sort of speaking about the provenance of this novel.
Yeah.
And the short of it is that I came to this country at the invitation of the great Nigerian writer, Chinua Achebe, to be the founding editor of a magazine that he published. That magazine failed after 3 years of really getting a lot of critical review, but we didn't have funding. And so one day as I stepped out of a bookstore, I ran into John Edgar Wideman, and we started a little conversation. And finally he said to me, "What are your plans?" I said I hadn't figured out my plans post the publication that had become defunct. And John Wideman then said to me, you are writing a novel, right? I wasn't writing a novel, but the way he asked the question, I felt the answer better be yes. So I said yes. And one of those occasions where you tell a little fib and you think that there'll be no consequence. But he said to me, "Can you find me 15 to 20 pages of that novel? And let's see if we can get you into the MFA program at UMass." So I got home and started writing. And the subject for me was not in doubt. I was always intrigued by silence and power, the conjunction between silence and power. What are the reasons? What are the many reasons that we get tempted to be silent? And what role does power play in that whole phenomenon? So I wanted to examine this, and also the many ways in which people are silenced or people silence themselves. So that became the subject of my novel.
It's interesting. I've heard that story before, that Ngugi wa Thiong'o also had a similar situation where he was asked, was he working on something, and he
That's right.
told a little lie. Yeah, that's
right. And then Ngugi has told me that story. He told it to me. He told it to me when he and I met in Kenya at a literary conference. So I told him that when I forged this 23-page of something I didn't know whether it resembled fiction at all, and gave it to John Wideman. 2 days later, John called me and he said he found it so fascinating. And he said it reminded him of the writing of Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Mm-hmm.
I told the story to Ngugi. He then told me that was, again, how he started his literary career, by telling me that.
Well, let me start with just one quick question to the two of you, and then we can go into the reading. And that really is, what as a writer, writing a debut novel, what kind of courage did that require of you as a writer? I mean, what kind of leap of faith did it take for you to write a first novel? Were there fears? Were there, doubts?
There were certainly doubts. I was very intimidated when I set about writing An Untamed State, because I did not know if I was going to be able to write a novel. I had only, until that point, written short fiction and a couple essays. And so I told myself that I would just write 100 very short stories and smush them together. But once I got into the writing of the story, it sort of felt organic. And even though I was terrified, I just kept writing. And I actually wrote every day for about 8 to 10 hours a day for 4 months and finished my first draft. And so it was intimidating, but I did it anyway, which is how I accomplish most everything in my life.
Yes. Well, absolutely. For me too. How could you not be intimidated? Especially if you're a reader. And I was a reader from a very young age. My mother was a school teacher. So in order to be allowed to go out and play, I had to earn it by reading, you see. And so I was just in awe of this organism that we call a novel, and everything that goes into it and the way that it holds together. So I loved fiction, I loved reading, but because I loved it so much and I was aware of this, the complexity of it, I wasn't confident at all that I had the know-how to put one together. So I lived through that dread as I, throughout the 3 years that it took me to compose a first draft.
And Roxane, you knew you wanted to write about Haiti, or at least set it partly in Haiti. Had you written about Haiti before?
Absolutely. I had written a book about Haiti, short fiction and a couple sort of micro nonfiction called Haiti. And then I decided, okay, I had written this story, Things I Know About Fairy Tales, and I knew that I wanted to do something more with that story. I knew that there was more story there. And so I was very interested at the time in stories about kidnapping.
Right.
Because it's a thing that happens to this day.
Yeah.
And I was just interested in what does it take for someone to believe that this is a viable way of making money, and what kind of desperation or frustration leads to that sort of lawlessness. And I wanted to be able to humanize everyone involved. And I tried.
And okay, you call your novel is set in a small West African country that you call Madia. How is it like your own country of Nigeria, and how is it not like Nigeria, and why did you fictionalize it?
Sure. Well, Madia is actually a thinly veiled Nigeria.
Right.
So anybody who is aware of the political biography of Nigeria would recognize that Nigeria is actually the staging post for this novel.
Right.
But as I said, I had a great interest in exploring issues of madness in the novel. So actually naming it Madia is, to play on to sort of create a sonic connection with madness. But also I wanted my novel to serve as a kind of cautionary tale of what happens when people fail, either out of moral cowardice or for some other reason, to speak in situations where speech is imperative, where it is important to speak. And so I didn't want anybody to read that novel who was an American, say, or from Cameroon or from Kenya, and say, okay, this is a terrible thing going on, but it's happening in Nigeria. It has nothing to do with me. So I wanted a name that would then implicate the entire world, as it were.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that silence. I want to talk about that a bit, but I wanted to ask you both, who were some of the authors of books that were models for your first novels? Okay, you mentioned Sophocles, but also Wole Soyinka in his prison memoir, A Man Died. And there's a passage in that where he says, "The man dies in all who keep silent in the face of tyranny."
Yes, yes. So this is a book that I read when I was in high school, and anybody who's read Wole Soyinka would recognize that Soyinka is a very difficult writer. So here I was in high school with a rather undeveloped diction taking on Soyinka. And so much of this prison memoir was absolutely impenetrable for me. But yet when I came upon that line that the man dies and hope keeps silent in the face of tyranny, and there's another line that was equally resonant. Soyinka says that justice is the first condition of humanity. So those two quotes in the book continue to resonate with me. And then years later in America, I encountered the drama of Antigone. And it just spoke so powerfully. It's as if Soyinka pointed me to Antigone, and Antigone enriched my reading of Soyinka and in the exploration of power and silence.
And Roxane, were there models for the kind of book that you were looking to write?
Yes, certainly. I read quite a lot in the lead up, but I was particularly interested in Room by Emma Donoghue, because the first, I would say, third of the novel takes place in basically a small claustrophobic room. And I wanted to, one of the things I admired so much about Room is how for the first half of the novel, first maybe 2/3 of it, it takes place literally in a room, and that room seems like an entire world. And I wanted to be able to bring about that same feeling of a room being an entire world. And so I read that, and I was also interested in thinking through how to write about violence and trauma. and being part of the diaspora. And so for that, I read The Dew Breaker by
Edwige, yeah.
And trying to remember what else I read.
Well, can I ask you?
That's missing, but it'll come to me during our conversation.
Let me ask you about this idea of silence. Both novels deal with horrific acts of violence and the struggle of the characters against silence, of being rendered mute. So Roxane, especially in your book, Muriel, what's that?
It's Mireille.
Mireille is really trying to reclaim her voice after this kidnapping and the torture. So tell me about her struggle to find her voice again.
You know, Mireille goes through something terrible. It's not only that she's kidnapped and held hostage for 13 days and assaulted multiple times. Her father refuses to pay the ransom. And that's really what breaks her more than the trauma of the kidnapping. And she has to find a way to reconcile that her father did this thing, that he was unable to have enough empathy for people around him to do the right thing. So I was just very interested in telling that story. And so for Mireille, the further away she gets from the kidnapping and the more she sees that her father failed her and that his justifications were bullshit, the more she was able to articulate that she knows that he betrayed her and that his betrayal was unacceptable. And so it was time and distance and help that really enables her to find her voice again.
And Okey, Bukuru, the character in the novel who's accused of these crimes, struggles with his own sense of speaking up. Earlier in his past, he was silent, and now he regrets it, and he takes a stand. So tell me about his struggle with silence and voice. His grandmother tells him a story that must be told never forgives silence.
Yes, that counsel from his grandmother for me represents the moral center of the novel, really. You know, so the woman is the repository, if you like, of moral insight. The grandmother,
right?
So Bukuru is a journalist. And so the traditional professional role of a journalist is to speak, to bear witness, as it were, to report. And yet this man finds out that a woman who's a prostitute and a lover of his has been brutally raped by a military officer. But he decides that he doesn't want to be involved in that story. So he moves away. And ultimately, this military officer kills the woman. He still maintains, in fact, he becomes even more resolute in his silence. And because he doesn't speak up, because he doesn't, as it were, peel the mask off of this monster, a few years later, there's a coup d'etat in this country, Mahdia, and this same rapist and murderer now becomes the military dictator in the country. And of course, because the military has removed a particularly corrupt civilian administration, there's celebrations out in the street. People think that the military has come to put things right. But Bukuru alone, of at least more than anybody in the country, recognizes that in fact the country has taken a worse turn, and so he's haunted by his initial decision to be silent. So in a lot of ways, then the novel bears out this advice from his grandmother that a story that must be told never forgives silence.
And what are ways both characters, Bukuru and Muriel, how do they resist? How do they show courage in the face of this power and tyranny of both the state and in the individual, of the commander in your novel, Roxane, tyrannizing her and Bukurus in the courtroom in your country. How do they resist and fight and survive this kind of tyranny?
For Mireille, she tries first to hold on to herself and to remember her family. When she's kidnapped, she's visiting her parents in Port-au-Prince from Miami with her husband and their 9-month-old son. And so she just tries to hold on to that, to the memories of her family and to the love that she knows that she has. And we see in the series of flashbacks, the love story. And,
Right.
you know, sort of losing herself in that allows her to escape this terrible place that she's in. But once she starts to realize no one's coming to save her, she understands that she won't survive if she's holding on to who she was. And so she tries to erase all of her memories and become nobody, because if she's nobody, it doesn't matter what happens to her. And so she goes from, I wouldn't want to say an extreme, but from one coping mechanism that's embracing who she is to a far more extreme one where she tries to erase who she is so that she's nobody and that it doesn't matter. And in doing so, especially toward the end of her time with the commander, she's defiant, and she's defiant in a way that he might not understand or perceive as defiance, but that she knows is defiance, that he can't really reach the best parts of her because she has kept them hidden and locked away. And I think that silent defiance can be incredibly powerful.
Yes. So in the case of Bukuru, as I said earlier, he refrains from speaking at a time when his speech might have saved his nation a ton of tragedy. But ultimately, years later, the nation haven't seen the tragic consequences of allowing this false savior, this military dictator, to install himself and ultimately to make himself the perpetual ruler. Bukuru finally falsely accused of raping and killing prostitutes on a beach where a number of the remains of prostitutes have, as it were, washed up. He's able to bear witness that it is actually military soldiers who have been, who do a sweep of the streets of the city and pick up prostitutes and bring them to the beach and gang rape them. And in the course of this, some of them die, and their remains are abandoned there. So Bukuru ultimately speaks. The sad thing is that he speaks when it's almost too late for the country, but it's still important. So in the novel, in my novel at any rate, my vision is that to speak in itself, and that this is something that I got from Roxane's An Untamed State, just reading it and seeing something so difficult, and yet Roxane invites us to stay with this. You know, it's wrenching, but she makes us go through that experience, and it's very transformative, the telling.
And he also writes his life story, doesn't he? He writes a note while he's in prison.
Precisely, and bequeaths it to somebody
who could, a journalist,
who could be his son. You know. But, yes. You know.
Yeah. Why don't we do a short reading, and then I'll ask a few more questions, and we can see if there's any audience questions as well. Okay, do you want to read from Arrows of Rain?
Okay, sure. I'm going to read a short section. So this is the day of the coup d'etat, when the military takes over in this country. And a photographer, a press photographer, has been beaten to a pulp just for taking the pictures of soldiers who are milling all over the streets. And that night he dies in his sleep. So so this is from the point of view of this journalist who had failed to speak earlier. So that night, the photographer died in his sleep. His death provided a focus for my disparate feelings about the coup. I thought again about the people celebrating out in the streets, like children welcoming a first rainfall after a long, hard, dry season. It all reminded me of a story my grandmother once told me about the ambivalent character of rain, sustainer of the earth's plenitude, but also the harbinger of malaise. Once upon a time, a great famine struck a remote village that was located beyond 7 seas and 7 wilds. The famine was caused by several years of drought that made the earth too hard to till. Horrified by the rate at which their fellows died, the villagers consulted a Ndibe, that's a traditional healer, to find out the source of their affliction. The diviner said that a sacrifice must be carried to the boundary between earth and sky. The errand must be performed by a creature nimble of foot and ample voiced, for the journey was far and the sky was hard of hearing. The villagers decided to send Dog. They instructed him to hasten without distraction. But Dog strayed up many times. He sniffed the air for game, joined a group of hunters he met in the forest, tarried to watch a wrestling match, traded wits with tortoise, sang with a traveling choir of birds, danced with a troop of gazelles. By the time he eventually arrived at the boundary, the sky had drifted off sullen. Dog backed and backed until the sky returned. Here, Dog said in a contemptuous voice, "Here's your sacrifice. Now send rain to the villagers." He flung the sacrifice on the ground and turned home, looking forward to all the stops he would make on his way back to the village. Weeks later, he reached the village to find it flooded. The villagers were all dead, their corpses afloat in pools of water. It'd been raining relentlessly since the day Dog insulted the sky. Rain has 2 faces, concluded my grandmother. It can give life, but its arrows can also cause death. Arrows of rain, my grandmother's phrase for rain's malefic face. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And there's your title there, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Arrows of rain.
Yeah. And Roxane, what section were you going to read from?
I will. Oh, that was a great reading. Thank you. I enjoyed it. I'm going to read from the opening chapter of An Untamed State. Once upon a time, in a far-off land, I was kidnapped by a gang of fearless yet terrified young men with so much impossible hope beating inside their bodies it burned their very skin and strengthened their will through their bones. They held me captive for 13 days. They wanted to break me. It was not personal. I was not broken. This is what I tell myself. It was hot, nearly 100 degrees, the air so thick it felt like warm rain. I dressed my son, Christophe, in a pair of miniature red board shorts and a light blue t-shirt with a sailboat across the front. I covered his smooth brown arms and his beaming face with sunscreen. I kissed his nose and brushed his thick, dirty blonde curls away from his face as he pressed his palms against my cheeks and shouted, "Mama, Mama, Mama." My husband, Michael, the baby, and I said goodbye to my parents, told them we would be back in time for dinner. Michael and I were taking Christophe to the ocean for the first time. We were going to hold him in the warm salt water as he wiggled his toes and kicked his chubby legs. We were going to throw him toward the sun and catch him safely in our arms. My mother smiled from the balcony where she watered her plants, wearing a crisp linen outfit and high heels. She blew a kiss to her grandson. She reminded us to be safe. We put our son in his car seat. We handed him his favorite stuffed animal, a little bulldog named Baba. He clenched his beloved toy tightly in his little fist, still smiling. He has his father's temperament. He is usually happy, and that is important to me. Before getting into the car, Michael double-checked that Christophe was strapped securely. He put our beach bags in the trunk. Michael held my door open, and when he closed it, he pressed his face against the window and blew air until his cheeks filled. I laughed and I pressed my hand against his face through the glass. "I love you," I mouthed. I don't say those words often, but he knows. Michael ran around to his side of the car. After he slid behind the steering wheel and adjusted the rearview mirror so he could see the baby, he leaned into me and we kissed. He rested an arm on the armrest between us, and idly I brushed the golden wisps of hair on his arms. I smiled and rested my head on his shoulder. We drove down the long, steep hill of my parents' driveway and waited quietly for the heavy steel gates, the gates keeping us safe, to open. In the back seat, Christophe cooed softly, still smiling. As the gates closed behind us, 3 Land Cruisers surrounded our car, the air filled with a high-pitched squealing and the smell of burning rubber. Michael's tanned knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel and looked frantically for a way out. His body shook. The doors of all 3 trucks opened at the same time, and men we did not know spilled out, all limbs and gunmetal. There was silence, the air thin, still hot. My breath caught painfully in my ribcage. There was shouting. 2 men stood behind our car, machine guns raised. Michael pressed his foot against the gas pedal to move forward, but a tall man with a red bandana across the lower half of his face, a man holding a gun, pounded his fist on the hood of the car. He left a small dent in the shape of his closed hand. He glared at us, then raised his gun, pointed it directly at Michael's chest. I threw my arm across my husband's body. It was a silly, impotent gesture. My husband's eyes were bright, and arcs of tears trembled along his lower eyelids. He grabbed my hand between both of his. He held me so fiercely, it felt like all those slender bones would be crushed. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxane. I want to talk now about the books that followed your debuts. And Roxane, I wanted to ask you, did it take a different sort of courage to write about your own life in essays and memoirs?
You know, I think every new writing project takes a new kind of courage, even though I don't necessarily know that I summon enough courage. I just find a way to work through the fear. And it was really challenging to write Hunger, which is my memoir. And it was challenging because, you know, I live in my body, and here I was writing a memoir of my body. I was terrified about the judgment I would receive and the ways in which I might be perceived, and the ways in which I would make myself vulnerable to write the book I wanted to write. And so it was so much harder. With a novel, it's fictional and it's all made up. And certainly I write about difficult things in my fiction, but I know that I can escape it. But when you're writing a memoir, you have to confront yourself over and over again for hundreds of pages. And so it was challenging.
And Okey, did you face challenges writing your memoir? I mean, different challenges?
Well, my memoir actually, I would say, was the least challenging book I've written. And the reason is that when I go to bookstores, I like to tell stories, and invariably I tell my stories. And so after my second novel came out, Foreign Gods, Inc., which has to do with a gallery based in New York City that buys and sells the statues of gods and sacred objects that are pushed from different parts of the world and collected by the wealthy. Almost everywhere I read, somebody would ask the question, was this story autobiographical? In other words, was I still of a god? So I kept entering denials and caveats and refutations and so on. So finally I said, almost organically, I felt that I had to tell my story, my American story. And I had a very interesting life in America. 13 days after I arrived in America, somebody robbed a bank, and the police arrested me and questioned me, thought that I was the person who robbed the bank.
Wow.
And so on. And just the encounter with winter and so on, and different ways of being in America. So I felt that I needed to tell that story. But these are stories that for years I've been telling both my friends and family, as well as my readers and my stops. So that felt organic. But still, whenever you sit down to write anything, you know, even for 18 years, I wrote a weekly column for a Nigerian newspaper, and week after week I suffered because you had to find a subject, you had to find a perspective, you had to wonder whether your perspective was going to resonate with people and so on. And sometimes you wondered whether you were simply wasting your time. So that kind of anxiety is always there, but it's also the nervous energy that propels one in one's writing.
Mm. I wanted to ask you both about how you've coped with the change, these last months, the changes, the chaos of the past months, the lockdown, the political chaos, and the movements and uprisings, both in the US and Nigeria. Has it affected your writing? Has it even inspired new projects? And for you, Okey, I mean, I suppose you have a sense that Arrows of Rain has this new relevance 20 years later with what's been happening now in Nigeria.
Yes, and not just in Nigeria, also in this country, which is, you typically don't think that when you write about certain issues, about silence, about power, and the way that power can be wielded, just the whole phenomenon of demagoguery and so on, that you're going to experience it in some parts of the world. But, you know, we've lived through very strange times. But Nigeria has just gone through, in October, through its movement against police brutality, where young people, especially after years and years, decades, in fact, of taking just homicidal police acts as a fact of life, that young people said, no, we're not going to accept this, and forced the government into making some concessions. But tragically, in the end, the government called out soldiers and police, and they just committed acts of carnage and killed still an unknown number of protesters who were out on the streets.
And have you written about this? Have you written editorials or columns? Or no?
Well, what I did was I did some interviews. I wrote a weekly column for 18 years, commenting every week on Nigerian politics and life and so on. And so when the young people took over the streets and they began to ask to, they began to take a hand in reshaping their lives. So many of my friends who, you know, and my fans, you know, wrote to me and said, you have to write about this. I said, the young people, this was a beautiful moment. All the years that I wrote, I had asked exactly for this. I had asked for young people to be involved. So I said, they are involved and they were telling their stories beautifully. And that it was one of the most beautiful moments in my life, following Nigerian life. Yes.
And Roxane, you've been writing editorials, right? I mean, for the New York Times and stuff.
Yeah, I've written some essays. You know, it's been challenging. I've been dealing with I don't know if it's writer's block, but I've been blocked for about 4 or 5 years now. And certainly I'm producing work, but it's not coming easily. And normally, you know, it does come easily or smoothly, maybe is a better word. And so everything feels forced, and it's good, but it's not as good as I would like it to be. And that's hard, but I have still actually been getting some work done this year. Normally, I've basically, before COVID, I was traveling every week, and I had been on the road since 2014. In March, I finally spent more than 3 weeks in one place. And so I am enjoying isn't really the right word, but I am appreciating this extra time
to settle in,
sit and just be able to think and be alone with my thoughts. And it's been great, that part, even though I resent the reasons why we have this much time to do things. And so things have been trickling out, and I increasingly have things to say, especially about this administration and politicians who are doing nothing in the face of a coup attempt. And, you know, I understand, don't give it oxygen, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that a lot of people are very scared, and it would be helpful if our leaders acknowledge that. But, you know, crazy.
But are you returning to fiction? Is that what you're saying?
I'm doing both.
Both, yeah.
I write, you know, I write both fiction and nonfiction. So I'm working on a comic book series, a new comic, and a YA novel, and some shorter stuff, and a TV show and a movie. So I've done a lot of fiction. And I'm also, hold on, I don't know why this phone is ringing. I'm also working on a book about a writing advice book.
Yeah. Well, reminder, if people want to get in the chat and ask a question, and also to buy the book, and I'll just ask. That's a phone call about a new opportunity, someone said. So true. Okay, just to go back quickly to what you just mentioned about younger Nigerian writers. I mean, you've been kind of a bridge between generations. You write, you know, of you know, friendship with Wole Soyinka and Achebe, and now there's a younger generation that's quite varied and outspoken. And so tell me, are you're very encouraged by these younger Nigerian writers?
Absolutely. I describe Nigeria as a country conceived in hope, but nurtured into hopelessness by its leaders. I call them ostensible leaders. And so for many years, every generation expected that the next generation will get it right somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And will seize the moment, as it were, and define a different path for the country. But in the end, the malaise has become so pervasive that people settle into its shape, you know, so it's easier to be as corrupt as everybody else and make as much money as everybody else. But that kind of system ultimately leaves too many people on the margins. And so in the end, I think that young people who at some point seemed to me almost lost began to get it right in music, in writing, and now recently in their political expression. And so it was a very heartening moment for me to see what was called the End SARS moment, you know, SARS. SARS is a special anti-robbery squad, which was set up about 1992 by the government, allegedly to end armed robbery and kidnapping and other such crimes. And suddenly the officers who were enlisted in SARS became the kidnappers and the armed robbers themselves, you know, and just killing people in very egregious extrajudicial ways and so on. And so finally, young people stood up and said, no, we're not going to allow this. And that was wonderful for me.
But I mean, as well, the novelists, there's so many young Nigerian novelists, or new generation that are, you know, writing powerful works. Helen Habila, Teju Cole, Chimamanda, Okey Emezi.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's, as I said, a
real variety.
The great development in Nigeria is that artistic flowering, you know. I find it even more powerfully in music, you know. So I remember going to Austin, Texas for a book festival, and I was invited to a home for a reception, and just was passing a street and somebody was blasting well-known Nigerian music and so on. So yeah, the writers, you know, lots and lots of Nigerian writers are getting attention around the world, both in this country as well as in Britain and Europe. And so that's really wonderful.
Let me go to some of the chat questions for you both. Roxane, any plans to teach any online workshops during the pandemic?
Yes. I don't know when, but yes, I am planning on doing at least, I did a series of 6 already. And I'm planning on doing more.
What was the biggest self-obstacle in developing your debut works, or would you do anything differently if you were to do it again?
Well, obstacles. Well, I wouldn't say that there was something I'll do differently because I didn't know I wasn't going to tempt myself into writing. See, if John Whiteman hadn't said you must be writing, right? So if I was going to do anything differently, it would have been to will myself into writing. I needed that prod by John Edgar Wideman. So the other thing is, of course, I then wrote the first novel as my work, my thesis, if you like, in the MFA at the University of Massachusetts. And the MFA has its great benefits. And for me, it worked. It gave me a handle on different aspects of the novel. But there are also ways in which the MFA can be stultifying of creativity. So I welcome the freedom, to explore different ways of telling stories rather than sort of the MFA mandated way of telling.
Mm-hmm. Roxane, would you do anything differently?
No, I would not.
Good.
The thing is, every day I become a different writer.
Yeah.
Or I'm the same writer, but I become hopefully better.
Uh-huh.
And so certainly my next novel will be, I hope, stronger than my first novel, but I did the best I could at that time.
Yeah.
And I did it in the only way I could, which is by figuring it out as I went. And so I learned a lot from writing that book. I learned so much, in fact, and I learned that I could write long work.
Mm-hmm.
It ended up being 108,000 words long. And so, no, I wouldn't do anything differently, because I think that as you develop your career, as you develop your craft, everything has its place and its value.
Let's see. I'm just finishing my first semester. I'm looking for books to read beyond yours for semester 2. Would you recommend, suggest any reading? I'm creative nonfiction MFA candidate.
I would recommend, I'm so terrible at coming up with titles off the top.
I know.
That's not my strength. I'm really great at, I'm really good at giving book recommendations, but I need to have my shit prepared on a little list. Otherwise, I completely lose my mind. And I'm unable to give a title, but it's the guy who's Croatian or Serbian rather, and he wrote an excellent essay collection about 7 or 8 years ago. He writes nonfiction. He lost a
child, did you say? He
lost a child.
It's not Alexander Heyman.
Yes, Alexander Heyman. Thank you.
Yes.
It's like, I do know what I'm talking about. So Alexander Heyman has an essay collection, and it's really about being an immigrant and at home and suffering and family and joy. It's gorgeous, 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 gorgeous. And I return to that time and again, and I think it's great. And I would also recommend Thick by Tressie McMillan Cottom, which is an essay collection that came out last year, and Pulphead by John Jeremiah Sullivan.
Well, I'm a fan of Walter Kern's Blood Will Out. That story really is fascinating on so many levels. Annie Dillard has this very slim book, which I talk about in the introduction to my to the 20th edition of my novel, called The Writing Life, which I really, really like very much. And anything by the great Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o is one of my favorite.
I see him right behind you, actually.
That's right.
I see Petals of Blood.
Ngugi, yes.
Yeah, the classics, Penguin Classic Edition.
Absolutely, yes.
These things keep jumping around. Let's see, do the causes you care about ever end up in your fiction writing naturally, or do they have to be incorporated purposely? Go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. I am who I am, whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction. And what I care about is going to make its way into my work one way or another. And I like that. I think that writing is political, whether it seems overtly political or not.
Yes, I would agree. I think that there is a process almost of osmosis where the ideas that are dearest to you find their way inexorably into your fiction or even into your journalism.
Yeah. What is giving you joy these days? Maybe we can end there.
My marriage. I got married over the summer. We eloped because we realized that we were not going to be able to have the massive wedding we were planning, which we're going to now have in 2021. And, you know, I think that the pandemic and all of this sort of social distancing and isolation for people in relationships, it has shown you, you know, what's going on there. And either your relationship is good or indifferent or terrible. And we found, you know, a lot of our friends were worried because I'm based in Los Angeles and my wife is based in New York, and we just sort of visit each other, and it's actually really great. But now when COVID started, she came to me in LA, and we've been living together full time ever since, and have decided, you know, like, we're not going to do this apart nonsense. We're just going to go back and forth together. And we made that decision and realized it because we do actually enjoy each other, and we do love each other and get along very well, even when you're spending 24 hours a day together every day. It's a lot, but that's been really wonderful. And I have been reading for a couple of awards this year. So I've been reading a lot of fiction and a lot of nonfiction. And, you know, people write really amazing stuff, even when they don't make the list, the finalist lists. You know, I just really give a lot of credit to writers for putting out such great work. It makes me feel very honored to be a writer in this time alongside so many great writers.
Yeah, what gives me joy, I think, is slowing down during COVID. And, you know, like Roxane, I do quite a bit of traveling, but just to cook is one of my passions. I like to feed people, and so I've had to cook for the family. You know, during the summer I cooked dinner every day almost, and actually went to visit my son who is in law school in Phoenix in August, and, you know, stayed with him for 12 days, feeding him as he started his final year of law school. And my wife and I have had, we usually love vacationing in Florida, in Gulfport, because we take long walks in the morning there. And so during this COVID lockdown, she and I have enjoyed doing 2 to 3 hours of just walking around the neighborhood almost every day.
And maybe a last question. What would you like for your legacies to be? I know it's a bit early to speak about your legacies, but what would you like for your legacies to be, and what do you hope to see in the next generation of writers?
You know, my legacy is, I hope, not what I've done, but the writers that I've mentored and worked with, and what they have produced and put into the world. I'm very proud of the work I do in that space, and my students and my mentees are absolutely my legacy.
Yeah, something along those lines, to leave work that is imperishable, and work that continues to speak to people and to inspire younger writers, and also just to be somebody who fought against the compulsion, the seduction of silence.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Okey, and thank you, Roxane. It's been really lovely to speak with you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such a delight to spend an hour with you.
Likewise, this has been wonderful. And I as you know, I loved Foreign Gods, and so this is really quite a pleasure.
And I'm a big fan.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the books, remember to please buy them from the bookstores. Yeah. And yeah, Okey, congratulations on the 20th edition.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Well, thank you both. Be well and have a wonderful holidays.
Everybody stay safe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay then.